Hello, welcome to the next session of Environmental Geology, Man and Geologic Hazards. Environmental geology investigates the relationship between society and the geologic environment. The three major areas of study are geologic hazards, which are including earthquakes, volcanoes, landslides and floods, and the management of the resources such as metals, rocks, fossil fuels and water, and environmental challenges such as waste disposal and groundwater contamination. In this session, we are discussing man and geologic hazards. Geologic hazards are not random striking events. They are occurring in specific places for specific reasons. If you can understand why they occur, you can predict where they will occur. And this branch of geology is dealing with the study of Earth's natural systems and their interactions with humans, and it is the applied geology. It is helping us to solve conflicts in land use in order to minimize loss of life and property. And the study is also helping us to minimize environmental degradation, and this also is useful in maximizing the beneficial results of using our natural and modified environment. Let us define a hazard. A hazard by definition is any event, phenomenon or human activity that may cause loss. There are natural and human induced factors which may act together to create a hazard. And there is another term called disaster. It is defined as an event that causes serious disruption leading to widespread human, material or economic losses beyond the coping capacity of a given society. And there are different types of hazards. Natural hazard is the interaction of human exposure and vulnerability and natural events that creates the potential for loss and disruption. Natural hazards are disasters that occur in this world naturally. They can happen at any location at any time throughout the universe. Natural hazards can destroy cities or sometimes a whole country if it is that severe. They can occur on land, in the water and with the weather, and accordingly there are different types of hazards. Natural hazards are hazards which are occurring naturally like wildfires, insect infestations, meteorite impact, etc. And there are some hazards which we can define as geologic hazards like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods and landslides. These are so defined because they are having a cause inside the earth. All geologic hazards are natural hazards also, and based on the time of effect of the hazard, they can also be defined as rapid onset hazards which are having rapid impact on us like earthquakes, flash floods, sudden windstorms, etc. Some other hazards are slowly operating like drought, which may take years to have their effect on us. And there are some category of hazards which can be called as technologic hazards, that is due to the exposure of hazardous substances by the use of these in the built up environment, like the use of asbestos, use of radon gas, which are causing hazard in the environment. And some hazards are created or they are having their origin from human being itself. They are called anthropogenic hazards. Examples for this category are acid rains, pollution, global warming, etc. And based on the effects of hazards, there are mainly three we can categorize, like primary effects, secondary effects and tertiary effects. Primary effects are the effects of the hazard from the event itself. For example, water damage from floods, collapse of building during the ground motion of an earthquake, which are directly caused from the hazard itself. Secondary effects are the effects which are produced not direct from the hazardous process. For example, the forest fires which are touched by lava flows, or the fires which are caused by the gas pipe leakage during an earthquake. And there are also tertiary effects which are long term or permanent effects, like loss of wildlife habitat or permanent changes of river courses during flooding, global climatic changes which are happening after a particular hazard. And when we deal with the hazardous events, there are terms like vulnerability and susceptibility which we should always remember. Vulnerability refers to physical effects of natural hazards and the status of people and property in the area. And vulnerability is dependent on several factors like proximity of a possible hazardous event. That is, when the earthquake is hitting a particular land area, the effect will be maximum nearer to the epicenter, and the effect will be decreasing on going away from the epicenter. And another factor is population density. If the population density is maximum in the area proximal to the event, then the hazard becomes disastrous. And scientific understanding of the hazard. If we are well aware of the science behind the hazard, we are able to face with the hazard. That is, tsunami when happened in Kerala in 2004, the people were totally unaware of that event. So, most of the damage caused due to the lack of understanding by the people. And public education and awareness of hazards. In most earthquake prone areas, even the children are knowing how to behave during an earthquake. So, proper education and awareness of the hazard help us to mitigate the effects of that hazard. Existence or non-existence of early warning systems and effective lines of communication are also a factor which is reducing the level of effect of a particular event. Availability and readiness of emergency personnel is also important during the occurrence of a hazard. Construction styles and building codes. In earthquake prone areas, there are strict building codes to follow. That is, they will be resistant to the damage, so that they can be either rebuilt or reproduced. And cultural factors that influence public response to warnings is also an important factor to vulnerability. Vulnerability is also influenced by some other factors. For example, less developed countries are more vulnerable to natural hazards than developed ones. Developed countries are having their own plans and methods to mitigate the event, which is less developed countries are not having. Another influencing factor is poverty. People are attracted towards the hazard prone areas because of their poverty. Human intervention can also increase the vulnerability. That is, through the development of habitat in hazard prone areas, Here also poverty is a factor. The people are attracted towards the volcanic prone areas because the soil in those areas are highly fertile, and this causes the effect of the hazard more. And another factor is by increasing the severity and frequency of the hazard. That is, in a landslide prone areas, if we are doing some agricultural activities, it will be inducing the hazard, or mining of underground water may lead to subsidence of the area, and over intensive agriculture can also lead to increased erosion. Affluence can also contribute to global warming. That is, the people who are more rich will be using more resources, and they will be contributing to more global warming. So, affluence is also a factor. In order to incorporate knowledge about natural processes into the planning of human activities, hazard assessment and risk assessment are done. These are the two processes which are always carried out in managing the hazards. First, hazard assessment. In assessing a hazard, we are doing some methods. That is, we have to ask some questions like when and where the hazardous events occurred in the past, and what was the severity of the physical effects of the past events of a given magnitude. How frequently we can expect events that are strong enough to generate severe physical effects. What a particular event would be if it were to occur now, and by getting answers to all these questions, we can portray this information in a form that can be used by planners and decision makers. Now, coming to the concept of hazard. Hazard concept is also involving some factors like exposure of the hazard, that is, the physical and geographical coincidence of human occupancy and investment and spatial extent of natural extremes. That is, when the people are located or exposed to a particular event, the population and poverty are at risk. In most cases, the hazard become more severe by the occupants of the people in the hazard prone area. And another factor is vulnerability, that is, the tendency of people, group or society to incur losses to hazards. And the hazard concept also take the term risk. Risk is actually a statement of the economic losses, injuries and deaths, and loss of functioning of urban support systems expected during a hazard. The probability of a given event and the potential loss from that event are dependent. Risk assessment involve hazard assessment, the exposure of the area to the hazard, and location of the area and community's vulnerability. We have seen how we can assess the hazard, that is, by asking some questions about the hazard, how they will occur, what will be the severity and what is the frequency of the hazard. Finding out the answers to these questions will help us in getting the hazard assessment. Secondly, location of buildings, facilities and emergency systems in the community is another factor which can assess risk. Their potential exposure to the physical effects of the hazardous situation or event, and the community's vulnerability, how they will be affected by the potential loss of life, injury or loss in value. These all are considered the factors in the risk assessment. And risk assessment helps decision makers and scientists to compare and evaluate potential hazards and make some priorities on what kinds of mitigation are possible and to decide on where to focus resources and where we have to do further study on this hazard. When dealing with the hazardous concept, we should also note resilience. Resilience is actually the capacity to absorb and recover from a hazard event. If a hazard occurs, the resilience capacity may be different for individuals or they may be collective, they may be having a collective effort to cope with the hazard. It also varies with wealth, preparedness and other factors. And after an event, the adjustment and adaptation for the after effects may take sometimes short term or sometimes long term. The responses are affected by the wealth, policy and decision making. In the management of hazard, there are factors like emergency preparedness. Emergency preparedness is important, that is, we have to plan for a hazard. If it is a frequently occurring hazard, we can plan accordingly. There should be casualty meeting and staffing procedures and equipment for reducing the losses from the potential events. And there should always be emergency response and management systems if such an event occur. And recovery is also a factor. A short and long term rebuilding and economic and other recuperation methods should be there if a hazard occur. Mitigation. Mitigation efforts to reduce vulnerability and to increase the coping up process like resilience over the long run, both pre and post hazard mitigation should be there. And there are some problems with response to hazards, that is, low probability may cause high consequence. That is, if a particular area is not prone to a particular hazard, people may not be aware of it or may be ignoring it. So that once a hazard is striking that area, the casualty may be maximum. But when there is high probability, if there is frequent occurrence of a particular hazard, then everyone will be aware of that hazard and so that the consequence will be minimum. And another factor is risk versus benefit. People are ready to take a risk for certain benefits, that is, to live in a particular place, to obtain resources like fertile soils on volcanic slopes and flood plains. That is, these people know that their life is on risk, but they are accepting their risk, calculating the benefit. And some problems with response to hazards. How much can people or societies invest in prevention, mitigation, etc.? If for mitigating the effect of a particular event, the authorities can build some expensive levees so that the event effect will be reduced. Another thing is risk perception. People assess risks differently due to experience. Experienced people may be able to know about the event so that they may take precautions. Age is another factor. Young people are ready to face the risk than old people. Gender is another factor. Personality. These are the factors which are including in the risk perception. And now let us think what is the role of scientist or geologist in the hazard assessment. Always geoscientists are the people who know about the geology or the science behind a hazard. So, they can very well assess the hazard correctly. And there are some methods for prediction of the hazard also. All hazards are not predictable, but based on the precautionary measures or based on the pre-events which are happening before an event, in some cases at least we can predict the hazard. And after prediction, it is also possible to reduce the risk of the hazard. And hazard zonation maps are always helping geoscientists to face the hazard, that is, hazard zonation maps for particular events can be created, like for earthquakes we can make hazard zonation maps, landslide we can make hazard zonation maps, which are noting the areas of high probability of that particular event. And it is able to identify and delineate unstable hazard prone areas, so that environmental regeneration programs can be initiated adopting suitable mitigation measures. And these maps help planners to choose favorable locations citing development schemes such as townships, dams, roads and other developments. And the hazard zonation maps, they are generally used to make master plans and land use plans. That is, we know that those areas which are highly prone to landslide is not at all suitable for construction of huge buildings, and those flat areas can be used for the purpose of car parking, etc. So, it is helping us in the land use planning, and it is also helping us in discouraging new development in hazard prone areas. And the choice of optimum activity pattern based on risk zones can be adopted, and quick decision making in rescue and relief operations can also be done based on the hazard zonation maps. There are some hazards which are rapidly occurring, like rapid onset, like earthquakes, landslides, flash floods, etc. Whereas some hazards like drought, desertification, subsidence are slowly operating, and some hazards are in some way controllable, but some are immutable events. Now, let us think of the fundamental concepts related to natural hazards. Natural processes have some certain service functions, and some hazards are predictable, and there is a linkage which is existing between hazards and physical and biologic events. Hazards that previously produced disasters can now also be producing catastrophes, that is, time is changing their effect. Risks from hazards can be estimated, adverse effects can be minimized. So, the hazard assessment and risk assessment is depending on the type of the hazards which is dealt with, like geologic hazards, the hazards like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes and explosive crater lakes, landslides, mud flows all come in this category. And there are some hazards which are called as biological hazards, which may include the epidemics, pest infestations, and there are some astrophysical hazards which are also natural, which are dependent on space weather and meteorite impacts. And the human induced hazards can also become disasters, like the global warming, conflict related hazards, land degradation and some small scale mining and artisanal mining, gas flaring and pollutions of air and water. And there are hydrometeorological events which can include floods, tropical cyclones, storm wave surges, droughts and extremely high temperatures which are produced by global warming, wildfires, etc. Floods are of different category which may be sometimes flash floods which may cause loss of life, damage to property and promote the spread of diseases like malaria, dengue fever, cholera, chikungunya, etc. So, in this session we have discussed about natural hazards, the types of hazards which are including natural hazards, geologic hazards, technologic hazards, anthropogenic hazards, etc. And we have also discussed the factors of hazard assessment and vulnerability assessment. And any hazard is dependent on how it is operating and how it is affecting the human beings. So, we are concerned of reducing the economic losses and the property losses which are dealt with a hazard. For that purpose, geologists are doing hazard assessment by noting the hazard assessment, they are able to develop some hazard zonation maps which are used in the mitigation of the effects of that particular hazard. So, thank you for listening this session of hazard assessment and risk assessment in natural hazards. Thank you for watching this session and we can meet in the next session.